In the final days of October, 1886, while every other settler in Frost Creek split firewood, Richard Cole was stacking discarded books floor to ceiling against his cabin's north wall. Thousands of them, pages facing the coming snow. His pregnant wife watched from the doorway as neighbors laughed and called it a professor's folly. But Richard had seen something they hadn't. A wall of paper could hold back a killing frost. Would his obsession save his family or bury them in a frozen paper tomb? Richard Cole was a man who'd spent his life believing in the power of the written word. A former professor of natural philosophy, he'd come west after tragedy, carrying little but a cartload of discarded books. When the brutal Dakota winter threatened, he did the unthinkable. He stacked those books floor to ceiling against his cabin's north wall. To the other settlers, it was the final proof that grief had broken his mind. But Richard understood something they didn't: paper, tightly packed, trapped still air. And still air was the difference between freezing and surviving. The true test would arrive with the first killing frost, and when it came, even his own wife feared that wall might become their coffin. The first wagon to stop was driven by Silas Barlow, a man whose face had been carved by 50 winters in the territory. He sat motionless on the buckboard, staring at Richard Cole's north cabin wall. Not at the logs, not at the roof, but at the books. Thousands of them stacked flat from the frozen ground to the eaves, spines facing outward in uneven rows. The afternoon wind ruffled yellowed pages that poked through gaps like tongues of frozen fire. Silas finally spat into the snow. "That ain't a wall, Professor. That's kindling." Richard's wife, Eliza, stood in the doorway, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was heavy with child, and the cold was already biting hard enough to paint her cheeks raw. Their son Thomas, 9 years old and small for his age, pressed against her skirt, watching the old trapper with wide eyes. Silas climbed down slowly, his boots crunching over crusted snow. He walked toward the wall, not touching it, as if afraid the whole thing might collapse. "You got an entire forest not 2 miles west," he said, "and you choose to burn paper. What's left when the blizzard hits and you got nothing left to burn but your own books? Words don't heat a cabin." Richard didn't stop working. He was wedging another volume into place, a heavy leather-bound treatise on botany that he'd carried across 3 territories. "I'm not burning them," he said quietly. "Then what in God's name are you doing?" Richard turned, wiping frost from his spectacles. "Paper traps air, layers and layers of it. Still air is the best insulator there is. Animal fur, wool, feathers, that's all they do, trap air. A wall of paper pressed tight does the same thing." Silas stared as if the man had just spoken in Greek. "You aim to keep winter out with a library. I aim to keep my family alive." The old trapper shook his head and walked back to his wagon. Before he climbed up, he looked directly at Eliza. "When the real cold comes, and it will, you send the boy to my place. I got a proper wood pile." Then he drove off, the sound of harness bells fading into the white silence. Eliza said nothing, but her hands were trembling, not from cold. It had been 6 years since Richard Cole left the university. A typhus outbreak had taken his first wife and infant daughter in the span of a single week. He had sat in their empty house surrounded by books, his books, the ones he'd spent a lifetime collecting, and realized that all the knowledge in the world couldn't reverse the hour of a death. He resigned his post within a month and headed west, taking only what he could carry, and a wagon full of books the university was going to burn after a library fire left them water-damaged and unwanted. They became his cargo, his burden, his past. The Dakota Territory was supposed to be a new beginning. He'd married Eliza, a quiet and resilient woman who'd lost her own first husband to a mining accident, and Thomas had taken to him as a father. They staked a modest claim near Frost Creek, built a sturdy one-room cabin, and tried to forget the world they'd left behind. But the books remained. Boxes and crates and canvas sacks stuffed with them, more than any frontier cabin had a right to hold. And now, with winter pressing in and their firewood supply dangerously low after a summer of sickness kept Richard from cutting enough timber, those books had become more than memory. They had become a possible means of survival. The idea had come to him one bitter October evening, when he noticed that the north wall of the cabin was already radiating cold like a tombstone. He'd stuffed an old newspaper into a crack near the floor to block a draft, and hours later he'd felt the spot. The newspaper was cold on the inside surface, but the wall behind it was far colder. The paper had stopped the air leak. If one sheet could do that, what could 1,000 sheets do? The next morning he'd begun the work. Each book was laid flat, pages facing the wall, the thickest volumes at the bottom where the cold sank hardest. He stacked them like bricks, pressing each new layer tight against the one below, staggering the joints so no straight seam ran from inside to out. He used wet clay mud between some of the outer rows to seal the gaps where bindings didn't quite meet. The wall grew slowly, row by row, a patchwork of faded leather and cracked cloth, gold-stamped titles half obscured by frost and mud. Thomas became his assistant. The boy learned to sort the books by thickness and size, handing them up to his father on a homemade ladder. He could soon tell a dictionary from a poetry volume by weight alone. At night, he traced the embossed letters with his finger before falling asleep. The other settlers in Frost Creek were not kind. They'd already pegged Richard as an oddity, the educated man who quoted poetry while planting beans. Now they had a new target. On market days, when the families gathered near the trading post, the jokes flew freely. Some called him Library Wall behind his back. Others, louder, said he was trying to build a monument to his own madness. A few of the older women whispered that grief had finally caught up with him and hollowed out his reason. But there were voices that went beyond mockery. Margaret Clary, the settlement's closest thing to a midwife and the woman who would eventually deliver Eliza's baby, came by one afternoon and stood with her arms crossed, staring at the north wall with open contempt. "You'll kill that child before it draws a single breath," she said flatly to Eliza. "Insulation is one thing, but paper, it soaks up damp. It rots. It brings vermin. You'll have rats nesting in that wall by Christmas and frostbite on your baby before New Year." Eliza had looked to Richard then, a single question burning in her eyes. He had no answer she wanted to hear. By the second week of November, the wall was finished. From floor to eaves, nearly 4,000 books formed a barrier over 2 feet thick in some places. Richard had carefully placed the volumes he considered most valuable, his wife's journal, a slim volume of Shakespeare sonnets, on a separate shelf near the stove where they could not be touched by the cold. Everything else belonged to the wall. The north-facing window was sealed entirely with stacked paper, leaving the cabin illuminated only by the small east and west windows. The light inside turned dim and yellow, like living in a cave of words. The first true test came on the night of November 17th. The temperature dropped so sharply that water froze in buckets placed a foot from the stove. Outside, the prairie lay silent under a crust of ice. But inside the cabin, something strange was happening. Richard sat awake long after midnight, a lantern burning low, holding his hand near the north wall. The interior surface of the books was cool, barely cool, not cold. He could feel no draft. He could hear no wind leaking through. The wall was holding. Eliza stirred behind him. "Richard," she whispered, her voice strained. "I think the baby's coming." And outside, carried on the bitter wind that was beginning to rise from the north, came the distant howl of a storm that no Bookwall might stop. Eliza's voice broke through the wind's rising howl like a splinter of glass. "Richard, the baby's coming now." She was gripping the edge of the bed frame, her knuckles white, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Outside, the first hard gusts of the blizzard slammed against the cabin, and the north wall, the wall of books, moaned. Not a groan of breaking, but a low, papery hum, as if 4,000 volumes were whispering warnings to one another. Richard moved quickly. He stoked the stove until the iron glowed dull red, then pulled every blanket they owned from the loft. He set water to heat. The small east window had already gone blind with driven snow. The west window showed only a swirling gray void. They were alone. Margaret Clary, the midwife, was 3 miles across open prairie, and no human could cross that distance in a whiteout blizzard. He knelt beside Eliza, taking her hand. "I'll do this," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've read medical texts, I remember." She stared at him through a film of pain. "You've read poetry more often." "Poetry won't help tonight," he said, and forced a smile. The storm intensified into a continuous roar. The cabin timbers groaned, but the book wall held. Richard placed his palm flat against the exposed spines of the inner layer, cold but not freezing. A few inches behind, the outer pages faced the full fury of the blizzard. He calculated the thermal gradient. Paper, even when pressed flat, was a poor conductor. The still air trapped between each sheet was the real armor. A wall 2 feet thick meant over 2,000 layers of dead air. It should hold. It had to hold. Just before midnight, the first crisis came. Not from the wall, but from Eliza's body. The labor stalled. Contractions weakened just when they should have intensified. She was exhausted, shivering despite the heat, and her lips took on a bluish tint. Richard recognized the signs of shock and cold stress. He piled blankets on her, but the real enemy was invisible. The cabin was still warmer than outside, yet her blood was retreating from her extremities to protect the baby. If she lost too much heat, the birth could kill her. He made a decision that felt like blasphemy. He went to the shelf where he'd placed his wife's journal, the Shakespeare, a handful of irreplaceable volumes. His hand hovered over them. Then he pulled down a water-damaged encyclopedia of natural history, already half ruined, its pages brittle with age. He tore out a thick sheaf of pages and fed them into the stove. The paper flared bright heat pulsing into the room. He fed more. The cabin temperature rose enough that Eliza stopped shivering. She blinked at him, understanding what he'd done. "The books," she whispered. "They were made to save lives tonight," he said, "not to outlive us." The labor resumed. For 2 hours, Richard moved between the stove and the bed, boiling rags, timing contractions, speaking calm words he did not entirely feel. The wind outside never relented. The north wall hummed. And then, at the deepest part of the night, Richard noticed something strange. The humming had changed pitch. A section near the floor sounded higher, sharper. He crawled to inspect it, lantern in hand, and found the problem. The lowest row of books, heavy medical texts from a defunct Philadelphia hospital, had been pressed directly against the packed earth floor. Damp had wicked up through the pages over the past weeks, and now that moisture had frozen solid. Ice crystals had expanded between the pages, forcing them apart. A narrow crack had opened, and through it came a thin, needle-sharp blade of cold air, impossible to block from inside without removing the entire row. The wall was breaking from the bottom up. Richard swore under his breath. He could not let that crack widen. He pulled off his coat and shoved it against the floor gap, but the wind pushed back, the fabric billowing. He needed to melt the ice and repack the space simultaneously. He grabbed the iron shovel from near the stove, scooped a mound of hot ash and a few glowing embers, and carried it to the wall. Working with desperate care, he held the hot shovel near the frozen section, not touching the paper, just letting the radiant heat soften the ice. Pages crackled, steam rose. As soon as the mass became pliable, he rammed more books into the gap, old ledgers, a heavy dictionary, wedging them tight with the blunt end of the shovel. The whistle faded, then stopped. He sat back, breathing hard, and realized his hands were shaking. Eliza's cry brought him back. The labor had shifted again. The baby was coming. Now, the next hour blurred. Richard's hands, trained in nothing but turning pages and tilling soil, became the instruments of a frontier birth. He guided his daughter into the world as the blizzard screamed around them, as the book wall stood silent guard, as the lantern flame burned steady in the still air. The infant girl let out a thin, ragged cry, small but insistent. Richard wrapped her in a warmed cloth and placed her on Eliza's chest, but the joy lasted only moments. The baby's breathing was rapid, shallow. Her tiny limbs were dusky. The cold, held back by paper and prayer, had still done its work. She needed warmth beyond what the stove could provide. Richard looked at the book wall, and the thought came to him with terrible clarity. The wall was saving them, but it was also sealing them in. They could not leave. They could not fetch help. The wall had become their world. He did the only thing he could. He tore down another handful of pages from the encyclopedia and burned them, building a small fire in a tin basin near the bed, creating a radiant heat pocket around mother and child. He fed the flames with more paper, more pages, and watched the room's temperature climb fraction by fraction. The baby's color slowly improved, but Richard knew this could not last. They had perhaps a few dozen books left that were suitable for burning without damaging the wall's integrity. After that, they would be out of fuel. The wall itself could not be burned. Doing so would let in the full force of the storm. They were trapped in a cage of frozen literature. Outside, Silas Barlow had tried to reach them. As the blizzard reached its peak, the old trapper had saddled his horse and ridden a half-mile toward the coal claim, hugging the tree line. He'd spent 30 winters reading drifts, and he knew that north wind-driven snow would pile deepest against any solid barrier. He feared the book wall had already collapsed and the family was buried. But his horse refused to go farther. The wind was so strong it was stripping bark from the trees and visibility was zero. He turned back, swearing into the white. When he reached his own cabin, he told his wife, "They're gone. No one lives through that in a house made of paper." Morning should have come, but it did not. The storm stretched into its second day without a pause. The cabin's interior light was a permanent twilight, the windows completely covered with snow. Richard had stopped sleeping. He moved constantly, checking the baby's temperature, checking the wall for new cracks, feeding the tiny fire, listening to the wind. He discovered that the wall was not uniform. Some sections were cooler, some warmer. The coldest spot was where the books were tightly bound with hard covers, because the covers conducted more cold than the soft, fibrous pages. The warmest areas were where old newspapers and pamphlets had been stuffed, their rough edges creating more trapped air. The wall was teaching him, even now. By the end of the second day, a new sound entered the cabin. It was a long, rushing hiss, not like the earlier whistle. It came from above the roof line, not against it. Richard listened, and a slow realization dawned. The wind was curling upward after striking the wall, forced to rise by the sheer mass of paper. That upward deflection was carrying snow high over the roof instead of piling it directly on the house. The book wall wasn't just stopping the wind. It was reshaping the entire drift pattern around the cabin. If his theory was correct, the worst of the snow was being dumped beyond the perimeter, leaving a hollow of still air around the home. The storm itself was building a berm of snow that would act as additional insulation. He began to believe they might actually survive. But Eliza had grown weaker. The birth had been hard and the cold had taken a toll. She could not produce enough milk. The baby fussed and cried, and Richard had no way to feed her except a thin gruel made from the last of their cornmeal. They were running out of everything: food, fuel, and time. Then, on the third night, the north wall saved them a different way. The pressure of the wind outside and the warmth inside had caused condensation to form deep within the book stack. But instead of soaking through and rotting the pages, the moisture froze in the outer layers, creating a matrix of ice and paper that was nearly solid. The wall was becoming a permafrost barrier, impervious to the sharpest drafts. The inner surface remained dry, slightly cool, but completely windproof. Richard touched the spines and felt a faint vibration, the storm raging just inches away, but inside the air was still. He had not built a wall. He had built a weather machine that taught the blizzard to exhaust itself. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally stopped. The silence was so absolute that Richard could hear the babies breathing from across the room. He wrapped his coat around his shoulders, took up the shovel, and went to the door. It took him 10 minutes to dig through the packed drift that had sealed them in. When he finally pushed the door open and stepped outside, he stood in the middle of a frozen moonscape. The book wall, visible from the outside, was encased in a thick shell of ice and compacted snow. Icicles hung from the outer bindings like fangs, but the wall stood intact. Not a single book had fallen. Beyond the wall, the snow had piled into a massive curved drift that rose nearly to the roof on 3 sides, exactly as he had hoped. The cabin sat in a bowl of still air, protected, insulated, alive. Before he could fully absorb the sight, he heard the distant crunch of boots. Silas Barlow was trudging through the snow, his face a mask of astonishment. He'd come to dig out bodies. Instead, he found smoke rising in a straight column from the chimney and a man standing calmly beside a wall of books, covered in frost but unbroken. Silas stopped 20 yards away and stared. His mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he said, "I told you to burn them." Richard looked at the wall, then back at the old trapper. "I didn't build it to burn." He opened the door wider, and from inside came the faint, hungry cry of a newborn. "I built it to keep her alive." Silas didn't answer. He just looked at the wall, the snow, the smoke, and the valley the storm had carved around the little cabin, and he understood. The story of the book wall did not fade after the first blizzard. Silas Barlow, a man who had spent his life mistrusting anything that wasn't wood or iron, became an unlikely messenger. Over the following weeks, he told anyone who would listen about the sight that had greeted him that morning: smoke rising straight into a pale sky, a wall of frozen books standing solid, and a newborn crying from inside the warm darkness. Some settlers still scoffed. Most were simply curious. They began to drift by the coal claim in ones and twos, ostensibly to see the baby, but always to look at the wall. Margaret Clary arrived on a cold afternoon in February, the same woman who had predicted the wall would kill the child before it drew breath. She examined the infant girl, named Florence, after no relative, but after the Italian city where Richard had once dreamed of studying, with the practiced hands of 20 years of frontier midwifery. Then she stood before the north wall and studied it with equal intensity. She pressed her palm against the exposed spines, felt the faint vibration of cold air moving beyond the outer layers, and finally turned to face Richard. "I was wrong," she said, her voice carrying no warmth but no hostility either. "But I'll say this now and you'll hear it: paper burns. If your stovepipe ever cracks or a spark lands wrong, this whole house goes up in minutes. You won't have time to save the baby. You won't have time to save any of them." She looked at Florence in Eliza's arms. Think on that. That warning buried itself in Richard's mind like a splinter. That night, he studied the wall from every angle, mapping the gaps between books where air could flow, calculating what would happen if flame met paper in those confined spaces. He concluded that Margaret was right, but also that the wall, being packed so tight, might actually resist flame longer than loose paper, because the lack of oxygen between the compressed pages could slow combustion. Still, he moved the stove an extra 2 feet from the wall, built a clay barrier behind it, and hung a wool blanket soaked in water near the chimney. He could not remove the risk entirely, but he could reduce it. Spring thaw came grudgingly. As the outer ice melted, the books revealed themselves in layers. The outermost volumes were permanently fused together by ice crystals and mildew, their pages brittle and stained. But the inner layers, protected from moisture by the cold barrier, had survived remarkably well. Some books were still readable. Richard carefully extracted them, and as he did, Thomas began asking questions about the titles, the authors, the worlds inside. The boy had learned to read from the wall itself, tracing letters he could not yet understand. Now he wanted more. Thus began an unexpected transformation. In the long, slow evenings of early spring, when the wind still bit but the worst cold had passed, Richard began reading aloud to his family from the surviving books. Eliza, still weak but recovering, listened with Florence in her arms. Thomas memorized passages. The one-room cabin became a classroom. Word spread, and a few neighbors, hungry for anything that broke the monotony of frontier life, asked if they could listen too. By summer, the coal cabin had become the closest thing to a library in Frost Creek. Any family could borrow a book, provided they returned it before the snows came again. But a second winter was coming, and with it, a trial far more complex than the first. The summer was short, too short. Richard had intended to cut enough timber to supplement the wall, to build a proper woodpile and a snow fence in case the book wall failed under a more sustained assault. But an outbreak of scarlet fever swept through the settlement in August. Thomas fell ill. So did half the children in Frost Creek. Richard and Eliza spent weeks nursing the boy, and the axe gathered rust behind the cabin. By the time Thomas recovered, the first hard frosts had already begun, and the cordwood pile was barely a third of what they'd had the previous year. They would enter the winter of 1887 with almost no practical fuel, only the wall. The first sign of trouble came early. In late October, a windstorm unlike any Richard had seen tore through the basin. It was not a blizzard yet, just a dry, howling gale that stripped leaves and tested fences. But it found a vulnerability in the book wall. During the summer, Richard had removed a few dozen books from the lower section to dry them out, planning to reintegrate them after resealing the mud gaps. He hadn't finished the work. The wind, pushing at 30 miles an hour, found those gaps and threaded through them like needles. Cold air flooded into the cabin from below, undermining the wall's ability to trap still air. The night temperature inside dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Richard realized his mistake. The wall was not a static structure. It was a living system that needed constant maintenance, constant adjustment, or it would turn on them. He spent the following days repacking every gap, adding a new outer layer of discarded ledger paper donated by the trading post. But he knew with a cold certainty that this winter would be different. The blizzards would be longer, the ice thicker, the demands on the wall greater, and the baby Florence was now a year old, walking curious. She had to be kept warm and she had to be kept safe. The stove burned constantly, the flames licking close to the paper. Margaret Clary's warning echoed in Richard's ears every time he fed the fire. The blizzard arrived on December 3rd, and it did not leave for 5 days. It was the worst winter storm in the recorded history of the Dakota Territory up to that point, a system that would later be written about in newspapers as far east as Chicago. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Livestock froze standing in their stalls. 3 homesteaders, 2 of them children, died in outlying claims when their roofs collapsed under the weight of snow and their fires guttered out. Inside the coal cabin, the situation grew desperate. The book wall held barely. The inner layers remained dry and cool but not freezing. However, the stove demanded constant feeding and Richard had run out of scrap paper. He turned to the wall itself, not the core insulating layers, but the books on the outer shelf, the ones positioned as windbreaks but not yet frozen. He tore pages from a Bible, from a manual on animal husbandry, from a copy of King Lear. Each page that burned kept his children's fingers from turning blue. Each page that burned was a wound to a man who had once believed that books were sacred objects, not fuel. The crisis reached its peak on the 4th day. A family from the far end of the valley, the Travers clan, appeared at the cabin door around noon, having crossed the whiteout on foot, their faces blackened with frostbite. Their own cabin's wall had failed, a log had cracked, letting in a drift that buried their stove. They had a baby, too, and a child Thomas's age. Richard and Eliza took them in. Suddenly the cabin held 9 people. Body heat helped, but the stove's demands doubled. The oxygen in the room grew thin. The wall groaned. Richard realized that the additional moisture from so many breaths was condensing on the inner book's surface, not freezing but softening the pages. The wall was slowly, imperceptibly beginning to fail from the inside. That was when the debate began. One of the Travers men, a hard-faced former rail worker named Ethan, looked at the wall with a hunter's eye. "You got fuel," he said. "Right there, 4,000 books. We don't need them to block wind, we need them to burn, tear out a section, feed the fire, save our children." Richard refused. He explained the principles of trapped air, the drift pattern, the way the wall lifted wind over the roof. Ethan listened, then said, "Sounds like Professor talk. My baby's lips are turning color. I'll tear it down myself if I have to." A standoff ensued, tense and quiet. Ethan stood by the wall, a hatchet in his frozen hands. Richard stood between him and the books, unarmed, his body the only shield. Eliza, holding Florence, spoke into the silence. "You tear that wall open, Ethan, the wind comes through and we all freeze in an hour, every one of us." Her voice was calm, factual. She had learned to read the wall's language almost as well as her husband. "The fire you think you'll build will burn out, and then you'll have neither wall nor fire." Ethan hesitated. Richard seized the moment. He proposed a compromise. They would burn only the outermost flaps, the loose pages he had already designated as sacrificial, and they would rotate the bodies towards the wall to share heat. But they could not breach the core. Ethan, faced with the certainty in the room, lowered the hatchet. The storm passed. The wall stood. The Travers family survived, their baby girl recovering in the warm envelope of still air. When the winds finally died and the dig-out began, the story traveled farther than any other from that winter. Not just that Richard Cole's paper wall had withstood the worst blizzard in memory, but that it had become a refuge, a lifeboat for desperate neighbors. And the fact that the wall had survived an internal conflict as well as the external storm, that a man with a hatchet had almost destroyed what the blizzard couldn't, added a layer of human drama that made the tale unforgettable. In the months that followed, the book wall became a symbol and a practical model. Richard never claimed to have invented the principle. He pointed out that trappers had long known that packed snow, which is mostly trapped air, was an excellent insulator. Paper was just another form of cellulose, like wood or dry grass, and when layered properly, it did the same work. But what made his experiment unique was that it turned a personal obsession, his love of books, into a scalable solution. The following autumn, half a dozen families in Frost Creek built their own book walls using old newspapers, catalogs, and unwanted religious tracts. They learned that any paper, tightly stacked, could create a dead air barrier. The settlement became known as the place where winter was fought with words, but the wall's greatest test was still to come. In the spring of 1888, as the snow melted and the ice retreated, Richard noticed something alarming. The core of the wall, the deep inner layers that had been repeatedly frozen and thawed, were beginning to rot. Not on the surface. The wind-whipped outer pages were desiccated and stable, but deep within, where moisture from the cabin's interior had migrated into the paper during the warm months. The rot was slow, almost undetectable, but it was spreading. If it reached a critical point, the wall would lose its structural integrity and collapse inward, taking the entire north face with it. And with a third winter only months away, Richard faced the hardest decision of his life: preserve the wall that had saved them, or tear it down and rebuild before the corrupting damp turned it into a death trap. Richard Cole knelt before the north wall in the pale light of a spring morning, his hands pressed against the inner layers of paper that had saved his family twice. The surface felt damp, spongy. When he pulled a single volume free, a heavy history of the Roman Empire, the pages separated like wet leaves, and the smell of decay rose sharp and fungal in his nostrils. He cut into the wall with his knife, peeling back successive strata of books. 4 inches in, the paper was merely stained. 8 inches in, it was soft and dark. A foot deep, near the original seam where the first winter's ice had formed, the books had turned to a dense, crumbling mat of cellulose mulch. The wall was eating itself from within. He showed Eliza that evening after the children slept. She held the lantern while he traced the affected area with charcoal on the floor. Nearly a third of the wall's lower section was compromised. If the rot reached the load-bearing core, the entire structure could buckle inward during the next winter's first heavy drift. "We have to tear it out," he said, the words dragging. "Every softened book, down to the solid paper, then rebuild before October." "With what?" Eliza asked. They had no more books. The summer was for planting, not for scavenging printed matter. The trading post had no discards. The nearest town, Millbrook, was a 4-day wagon ride, and they had no money for freight. Then Thomas spoke from his bed in the loft. He had been listening. "The neighbors," he said. "They built their own walls. They got books now. Maybe they'd give some back." The boy's idea became the seed of something larger. The next morning, Richard walked to Silas Barlow's claim. The old trapper had become a grudging ally, but he had also built a small book wall of his own that winter, using old newspapers and a crate of dime novels someone had left behind. Silas listened as Richard explained the rot, the danger, the need. Then he walked to his own wall, pulled out 24 dry books and stacked them in Richard's arms. "You saved my fool life once by not burning yours," he said. "Least I can do." Word traveled. By the end of the week, other families began arriving at the coal cabin carrying armloads of books. Not gifts, exactly, but loans. Investments in the wall that had sheltered the Travers children and proved that paper could stand against a Dakota winter. Margaret Clary came with a crate of old medical journals she'd been hoarding for years. The Travers family, still living in a repaired cabin, donated a box of religious tracts. Even some who had laughed at Richard in the beginning now contributed what they could: outdated almanacs, catalogs, a set of law books from a failed lawyer who'd moved on. The book wall, which had been Richard's private obsession, was becoming a collective project. The rebuilding took most of the summer. Richard and Thomas worked side by side, carefully excavating the rotted sections, cutting out the decayed paper, and setting it aside to dry in the sun. The dried mulch, Richard discovered, could be packed into gaps as a dense, fibrous insulation, almost like the sawdust and clay mixtures used in older construction. He mixed it with a little water and pressed it into thin bricks, creating a secondary barrier behind the new outer layer. Nothing was wasted. The wall that emerged by late August was stronger, deeper, and more resilient than the original. The core now had multiple layers: an inner face of dry, carefully selected books, a middle layer of compressed paper brick, and an outer windbreak of heavier volumes fused with clay paste. Richard had engineered a composite wall, blending the best properties of paper, earth, and trapped air. The winter of 1888 arrived late but hit hard. The first blizzard came in January, pushing sustained winds of over 50 miles an hour. The temperature at night dropped to -45. In other parts of the territory, that winter killed dozens of cattle, buried entire train lines, and froze homesteaders dead in their beds. But in the coal cabin, something remarkable happened. The new wall not only held, it performed better than ever. The inner surface stayed dry and just cool enough to touch. The composite layer absorbed moisture without losing integrity, and the drift pattern outside, shaped by the wall's updraft, built a berm that sealed the cabin in a protective hollow of still air. The stove burned steadily, but the heat lasted longer. The children slept without frost on their blankets. Florence, now a bustling 2-year-old, played on the floor near the stove, warm enough to kick off her knitted socks. And because the cabin was warm, it became a destination. At first, it was just Sela's, who'd grown accustomed to checking on them during storms. Then Margaret Clary, who came to check on the children and stayed because the warmth was better than her own drafty cabin. Then others, drawn by the rumor that the professor's house was the warmest place in Frost Creek. They brought what food they could spare, and they stayed for the heat. But they also stayed for something else. On those long, dark evenings, with the wind howling outside and the cabin sealed in its cocoon of paper and snow, Richard would take down one of the readable books from the inner shelves, the Shakespeare, the natural histories, the poetry, and read aloud. His voice carried through the small room, and the adults listened, many of them hearing stories for the first time since childhood. Children sat on the floor watching his face. The book wall that had been a physical shelter became an intellectual one. During the weeks of deep cold, the coal cabin transformed into what no one had planned, the first lending library in the settlement. Families began borrowing books to read in their own homes during the long nights. Richard kept a rough ledger, tracking who had what. Thomas, now 11, became the unofficial librarian, climbing the wall to retrieve requested titles. The books, once a wall, became a circulating collection. The boundary between insulation and illumination dissolved. Spring came, and the library did not end. People returned the borrowed books and took new ones. Some brought their own discarded volumes to donate to the wall's outer layers, thickening the defense while expanding the collection. The Cole homestead became the gathering place for meetings, for teaching children to read, for the exchange of news. When the territorial governor's representative visited Frost Creek in the summer of 1889, he noted in his report that the settlement had a curious public library housed in a dwelling, where books serve as both barrier and beacon. The phrase was printed in a St. Paul newspaper, and for a brief moment, the book wall of Frost Creek was known beyond the territory. But Richard Cole never sought fame. He continued to live simply, farming his small plot, maintaining the wall each autumn, and reading to anyone who came. Eliza gave birth to another child, a son, in the spring of 1890. The wall stood through blizzards, spring rains, and the dry winds of summer. Thomas grew tall and took over much of the physical labor. Florence learned her letters from the spines of the books that surrounded her bed. She would stand before the wall, running her small fingers over the embossed titles, sounding out the words. "His Torwhy of the Decline and Fall," she murmured, and her father would smile. The final surprising twist came years later in 1902. Richard Cole had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67, and the cabin passed to Thomas, who had married and started his own family. Florence, now 17, had become the unofficial librarian of Frost Creek, managing the collection that had grown to over 6,000 volumes. some permanently embedded in the wall, others shelved on rough-hewn planks around the room. She decided to catalog the entire wall, documenting every title, author, and condition. In the process, she discovered a book that her father had placed in the wall during the very first winter, a slim volume of poems by John Donne, water-damaged and almost unreadable, but which contained a handwritten inscription on the flyleaf. It was a note from Richard's first wife, written to him in the year before the typhus took her. To Richard, who believes words can mend the world, may they always keep you warm. Florence read the inscription, her father's hidden grief pressed between the pages of the wall that had saved his second family, and she understood. The book wall had been more than insulation. It had been a monument, a memory, a quiet act of devotion. She placed the book back in the wall in a position of honor near the center where it would continue to hold back the cold. Then she wrote in her catalog, Volume 2847, Poems of John Donne. Condition, fragile. Location, heart of the north wall. Value, beyond measure. The Cole cabin stood until the 1920s when the family finally built a larger house nearby. The old structure was dismantled carefully, and the books, thousands of them, still dry, still whole, were moved to a proper library building funded by the township. The north wall of that library, by a quiet decision of the town council, was constructed of thick insulating paper bricks, pressed from old newspapers and the discarded drafts of local writers. It was a deliberate echo, a lasting tribute. And if you visit Frost Creek today, now a small town of 800 souls, you'll find the public library still standing. On its north wall, behind a glass pane, there is a permanent display, the original spine of a John Donne poetry volume and a plaque that reads, Paper trapped the cold, and in the stillness a library was born. The words that once held back winter now welcome anyone who walks through the door. Richard Cole never set out to prove anything. He was a grieving man who looked at a wall of unwanted books and saw something no one else could see, a shield made of trapped air. That shield did more than keep the cold at bay. It kept a family alive. It sheltered neighbors when their own walls failed. And in the stillness it created, a library was born, a place where stories, once pressed flat against the winter, could finally be opened and read aloud. We tend to dismiss things that look fragile. Paper tears, paper burns, paper soaks through and falls apart. But Richard understood a deeper truth. Fragility is not the same as weakness. Layered tight with care and precision, even the flimsiest material can redirect a force as immense as a Dakota blizzard. The storm did not stop. It was invited to exhaust itself against a barrier of words. And in that exhaustion, something new grew, a community built around shared knowledge. The book wall of Frost Creek eventually became the town library, and the idea spread farther than anyone recorded. Homesteaders across the northern plains began experimenting with paper insulation, packing newspaper, catalogs, and discarded books into their walls. It was a strange, quiet revolution. The very things that people threw away became the difference between freezing and staying warm, between isolation and gathering, between silence and stories read aloud in a crowded cabin. Here's the question Richard's story leaves behind. How many of the things we call useless are simply waiting to be placed in the right order? A wall of books looked like madness until the wind came. A fevered obsession looked like grief until it saved a dozen lives. The line between folly and genius is sometimes just a matter of pressure, of being tested so completely that the truth can no longer hide inside the pages. What do you overlook today that might one day become your shelter? Richard Cole found his answer in the spines of 4,000 books. The winter found its match in paper and patience. And the next time you hold a book you think has no value, remember that its greatest power might not be in what it says, but in what it can stop. Subscribe to witness more of history's forgotten innovators, because sometimes the most unlikely walls are the ones that hold.